Marriage is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. And then when we get to the very end of the Bible, there's also an allusion to marriage. In Revelation 22, verse 17, it says, "The Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let him that heareth say, Come. And let him that is athirst come. And whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely." So these are among the final verses of the Bible. And here we read about the bride. The Spirit and the bride say, Come. And the bride here would be the church, God's people. So from the first pages of the Bible all the way through to the last pages of the Bible, there's many things in Scripture about marriage, said about marriage. And as long as this present world exists, as long as there's men and women in this world, which is, I imagine it's going to be up to the very end, marriage is a relevant topic. Anyone who takes the Bible seriously needs to know what it teaches us about marriage, and specifically as Christians, we need to know what the New Testament says about marriage. And too often today, in my experience at least, Jesus' teachings on marriage are deliberately skipped over or even rejected by people who claim to be his followers. Which, again, if you think about that, it makes really no sense at all. And we're not looking at Jesus' teachings this morning, but if there's anyone taking notes, I would write down Matthew 19 and Mark chapter 10. There's more he said on the topic of marriage and divorce and other things than just those two passages, but those are some two big passages which give some considerable information. Matthew 19 and Mark 10. And I'd write those down and look at them in your own time. Today, in our study of the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 5 is where we're at this morning. This is a passage which teaches us about marriage, about fidelity in marriage, warnings about infidelity in marriage. So all these things are found in chapter 5 and are related to what I've just brought up this morning. And looking at Proverbs 5, I've divided it into 3 points. Number 1, forewarned. Number 2, forgo. And then number 3, fidelity. And when we consider what the Bible says, it speaks about marriage in 2 ways. It speaks about, literal marriage, and according to the Bible, in just summarized terms, that is a lifelong union between one man and one woman. So, of course, that's just, regular, literal marriage. The Bible also speaks about spiritual marriage and how all Christians are, in a sense, married to God. And this idea is found in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Here's one example of that in James 4, verse 4, where it says, and he uses some strong language here, and he's trying to, really drive home an important point here. He says, "Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God." And so here the Bible is speaking again about our marriage to God. And I'll just use myself as an example. If I as a Christian, if I'm a friend to the world, meaning that I am someone who is condoning or practicing certain things and beliefs which are contrary to God's will, spiritually speaking, I'm an adulterer. In contemporary language, people today would say something like, I'd be cheating or committing infidelity. I'd be cheating against God.
Romans 12:1 is a good passage here. We're not to be conformed to the present age or world.
Yeah, Romans 12 would be a good one that goes along with this. Be not conformed to the world, right? So in both covenants, we find these uses of marriage, a literal idea of marriage, the joining together of a man and a woman, as well as a spiritual idea of marriage, that we're married to God, that we're married to a certain set of beliefs and principles that we are to follow throughout our life. And as we study Proverbs 5 this morning, I believe it has application for both. That Proverbs 5 gives us a lot of practical, everyday information about fidelity in marriage, but it also gives us some guidelines for our spiritual marriage to God. And so with those things in mind, let's begin with that first point, forewarned. Forewarned. And if we look at chapter 5, verse 1, Proverbs 5, verse 1, the very first word or phrase here is, my son. I forgot my water. I don't know what I did with it. Anyways, it says, my son. And so Solomon, and this is a recurring theme that we've talked about in previous classes. In the context of this book, Solomon is speaking to us as a loving father. He's speaking to us as his sons. And in a moment, we'll talk about why it's important that he is speaking, again, in the way he's phrased this book, he is speaking to primarily a masculine audience. He addresses us as his sons. So this is him speaking to us as a loving father would speak to his children, speak to his sons. And I think this is something that every parent can relate with. One of the things we do as parents is we forewarn our children. That is, we warn them beforehand about certain things.
Again, the Apostle Paul wrote 2 epistles to Timothy and 1 to Titus, Philemon, whom he addressed as his son in the faith.
There you go. Yeah, that's right. So there's this kind of idea of the family bond we have as Christian. Thank you, Lee. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. And as parents, we do certain things, especially with young children. We'll tell them, keep away from the stove or the oven when it's hot. We'll tell them, don't go out in the street, unless mommy or daddy are with you or grown-ups with you. Do not go out in the street. We do certain things to protect them. We'll take like the chemicals and cleaning agents in our house, and we'll keep them locked away or out of reach so they can't get into them. And we do all these things, and we warn our kids this way, not to make them afraid of the world, but to try and protect them and give them a certain level of knowledge, like, hey, these things can be dangerous if you're not careful. And expanding on that, as our children mature, we should do the same thing regarding spiritual matters. And Proverbs chapter 5 deals a lot with the dangers of an ungodly partner, or at the very least a tempting, here specifically a tempting woman, but for ladies it'd be a tempting man who is going to lead you away from God. And so we should heed this warning ourselves, but as parents, it's something we should care about for our children. Our Heavenly Father certainly cares about this. God our Father, speaking through Solomon, warns us about the dangers of illicit relationships. And so with that in mind, let's read verses 1 through 6. And is there a volunteer who'd like to read that? Proverbs 5, verses 1 through 6. Okay, thank you, Ron.
My son, attend unto my wisdom, bow thine ear to my understanding, that thou mayest regard discretion, that my lips may keep knowledge. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps take hold in hell.
Thank you, Ron. So again, this is a context specifically of a father speaking to his son, and sons in the plural. Even in verse 7, the King James says children. That word children is the plural for sons in Hebrew. And I just want to point that out because that does impact the reading and understanding of this book. And I'm not going to get too into this unless there's questions about it. But, the Bible, again, from cover to cover, teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so it follows naturally that if Solomon is acting as a father, teaching his son or his sons, that he's going to warn his son, his male audience, about the dangers of a tempting woman. Because that's the kind of thing a man's going to go after. And that's going to be enticing to the majority of men, even men who do not believe in the Bible.
Again, we think about Solomon and wonder why he didn't heed all this. And we also were reminded of Samson and Delilah.
Yeah, those are some examples. The life of Solomon himself is an example to consider regarding this. Samson is an iconic example, how he
was destroyed, really, by the Philistine lady.
Yeah. And, this book is not teaching that women are bad or women are evil and that the Bible's, has a misogynist message or anything like that. Again, this is a father telling his son there's certain qualities in a woman that you should avoid that kind of woman. And if we go to chapter 31, there's balance in this book. There's qualities that you should seek out in a woman. So again, there's balance presented in the book of Proverbs.
Seth, I was thinking, I don't have daughters, but I have granddaughters.
Mm-hmm.
And we've taught them, just like we would a son, the same principles.
Yep.
So it doesn't just relate to a boy.
That's right.
The girls need to be warned too.
That's right. And, excuse me, to go along with what Lucy said, I know in Mark 10 there's one example where, again, Jesus taught about marriage, and he stated the same things apply to men and women. There's not one set of rules for men and a different one for women. Sometimes the Bible will just talk about, one side of the issue. Like in the Ten Commandments, it talks about, not to commit adultery, not to covet your neighbor's wife. It doesn't say wives don't covet your neighbor's husband, but we all, understand it applies both ways. Just because it says don't covet your wife, it doesn't mean, women can covet husbands. So when we, let's just quickly go to Proverbs 31, verse 10. Again, we see there's balance in this book. There are things said about the kind of woman that a man should seek out in his life. And we're not going to read all these verses, but just to get an idea, we'll read a few verses here. Proverbs 31, verses 10 and following, it says, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands." And the thought continues there. But it talks about, in essence, it talks about a wife who's going to help her husband, she's going to be a benefit to her husband. When we look at chapter 5, that is not the kind of woman described in chapter 5. So in the first few verses here, going back to chapter 5, in verses 1 and 2, men are encouraged, men specifically, sons, are encouraged to learn these principles, to avoid this strange woman. So that's how I think it would first and foremost apply to men. And then for those who are ladies reading this book again provides a balance. It provides qualities, characteristics, which are not valuable in the sight of God, and others which are valuable, things which are virtuous, and not only something that honors God, but something a godly husband will desire in his life. Are there any questions, comments before we look at verse 3 in some more detail? Okay. When you look at verse 3, how is this strange woman described? Is she hideous?
Sweet.
Sweet, right?
Which window?
What was that?
The Witch of Wendor.
The Witch of Wendor. Okay. I don't know what that means.
Well, she's right the opposite of the witch.
Okay. Yeah, she's, like Lucy said, she's sweet. It talks about, her lips drip honey. Her mouth is smoother than oil. And by the way, this individual that Solomon's describing, this strange woman, she comes up in the book quite a bit. So this is not the first and only time we're going to read about this strange woman. So if you have your Bible, let's keep it marked here in chapter 5, Proverbs 5. And let's go back to the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 11. One of the words that Solomon uses frequently is the word strange, a strange woman. That's how the King James Version reads, and from what I've gathered, that is a literal translation of the term. Some of the versions will say something like a moral woman, or loose woman, or even I've seen one that says the adulterous woman. But strange is, from again what I've studied and learned, that is a more literal translation. And we should understand in the historical context of Proverbs and the Old Testament, a strange woman does not merely mean a woman who is a foreigner. Just because someone is of a different nation does not make them immoral. And I would argue that that doesn't mean that you can't consider them for marriage either. There's a few exceptions in the Bible. Moses married an Ethiopian woman. Ruth, for example, if you read the book of Ruth, who married Boaz, and through them Jesse was one of their descendants, and Jesse was the father of David, so Ruth became part of Jesus' family tree. Ruth was a Moabitess, so she was not an Israelite, and yet she married a Jewish man. So there are a few exceptions in the Bible about people of Israel marrying people of foreign nations. And
the word strange in itself is a great study. If you look at every place where it's found, it usually has to do with that which God has not commanded, is forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
And so these were strange women, in as much as Israel was not to intermarry with these women, but a lot of them, as were described here, were like Delilah.
Yeah.
Conniving, so.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. When we look at this, I'm sorry, go ahead. Is it Johnny?
I'm just going to say Rahab's another exception.
Okay, yeah, Rahab would be an exception as well. That's right. She's
And also in I'm sorry, it sounds so loud in here. In Nehemiah 13:26, the New King James says pagan women.
There you go. And yeah, that's the point I'm driving at. Again, we have to understand the context of the historical context of the Old Testament, how this word is used. Among the ancient Israelites, a strange woman almost always means a pagan woman. A woman who does not believe in Jehovah God. A woman who does not believe in the morality that is presented in the Old Testament scriptures. And there are several times in the Old Testament where we find a prohibition given to the people of Israel that they're not to marry strange women. And that's why, because again, almost in all instances, they're going to be a pagan woman who does not believe in God. And again, it's not just simply because they're a foreigner. Again, that's not the issue. It's because of what they believe. And again, we see those who are converted, like Ruth, he mentioned Rahab, who were converted and did believe in Jehovah God, and they married an Israelite.
God was trying to keep the Israelites pure. That's why the law forbade them intermarriage, as he was going to bring Christ in through seed. And so, again, the strange was that which was not authorized.
That's right, yeah. And, excuse me, I don't know if it's a change in weather Excuse me. I'm not feeling sick. It's just I can't clear my throat. We have this warning in chapter 5 about the strange woman. And again, it's not simply that she's a foreigner. This is someone who's going to lead you. That is, this person's going to lead you away from God. God's not part of their interests in life. And Solomon's words carry extra weight because he failed in this matter. And that's why I had us turn to 1 Kings 11. So 1 Kings 11, starting with verse 1. 1 Kings 11, verse 1, it says, "But King Solomon loved many strange women." And I couldn't find an answer. Maybe you'll have to do your own study. But I wondered if he wrote the book of Proverbs before all these issues he had or after these issues he had. And I don't know. But either way, again, I think his words carry more weight because he didn't go through with what he said. And he had some problems in this area of his life.
Most of the scholars date Proverbs in his early days when he was ruling and loved God.
Yeah.
He later went away, and I don't think any of his writings would have fallen in that area.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Sad.
Yes, sir.
One of the saddest expressions in the English language is one that we used to hear quite often, and that's "do as I say, not as I do." And
Yeah.
that's basically what's going on with Solomon there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sad, and we should try to avoid that if possible. So, continue reading here. It says, "He loved many strange women together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites." And then notice in verse 2, it says, "Of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, you shall not go in to them, neither shall they come in to you." So again, there's this prohibition. And we're told here the reason why. It's not because the God of the Bible is, what's the term people use, xenophobe? Where he hates foreigners or something like that, which is just a ridiculous argument if you ever heard anything like that. He gives the reason why in verse 2. He says, "For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." That's the reason this commandment is given. Because if you entangle your life with someone who does not care about God, that's going to have a negative influence on you. He says, they'll turn your heart after their gods. And notice it says, "Solomon clave unto these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." And it goes on to say how he even participated in building idolatrous places of worship because of the influence of his wives.
I was teaching these verses back in 1975 to a group of smaller kids.
Okay.
And one little girl, when I asked her about Solomon's wife, she said he had 300 wives or 5, whatever the year was, but said he had 300 porcupines.
There you go. 300 porcupines.
And most everybody here would know who that was if I called her name.
Okay.
Kim Burnett.
There you go. You got to watch out for those porcupines.
Yeah.
So, Solomon, sought out women who did not share his faith. I think this is one of the general principles we can learn from him. And also, we'll go back to Proverbs 5 now, what's stated in Proverbs 5. And because of that, it turned away his heart from God. And I think one of the major takeaways from this is we should always be humble, that no one becomes too great or too important where they somehow rise above the standard of God's word. Think about Solomon, very wise man, extremely rich, powerful, an inspired writer. He wrote a good section of the Bible. He wrote the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. A lot of the Bible, not a lot of Bible, some of the Bible is written by him, and yet he was a man who gave into temptation. And his heart, again, it says very clearly that his heart was turned away from God, and he did things which were not pleasing to God. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. And so we should always be humble, returning to God's Word, always trusting in God's Word throughout our lives. So as we consider Proverbs 5 this morning, again, the warnings here are not merely about a foreign woman or a foreign person. These warnings are about a woman who does not believe in God, and therefore her choices are immoral. She does not trust in God, and that's why she's described as immoral and doing wicked things. And I know this is the Old Testament. I think it's very clear here that the ideal, and let me stress that word, I believe the ideal is always someone who believes in God marrying another person who believes in God. And that's going to set you up for success and a faithful life in your marriage. Again, I think there are some exceptions to that, but I believe the Bible teaches the ideal is seeking out a spouse who's going to help you get to heaven, who's going to strengthen your faith in God, and not someone who's going to turn away your heart from God.
Not all Christians are faithful, and not all Christians are good partners in life. So there are exceptions.
And that's right. I mean, just because someone goes to the Church of Christ, let me be careful how I say this. You just do your due diligence to make sure. I'm speaking. I don't know if there's anyone here who's single, but if you're thinking about getting married, strive to, marry someone you honestly believe has faith in God and cares about God. Okay. That's going to make things so much easier in life. Just one example. Let's say a Christian marries someone of a different faith, or who goes to a denomination, or who's an atheist or whatever. What are you going to do once you have children? If that's something you want to do one day, where are you going to take your children? Are you going to go to one church one day and a different church the next day? If you marry an unbeliever, are your kids just going to stay home when that issue comes up because that's what mommy does or daddy does? They don't go to church, so I want to stay home with them. There's just so many problems that could be avoided. And that's just one of many, I think. That so many issues and problems can be avoided if you find someone whose faith is in sync with yours. It's going to, again, help you and give you strength in that relationship. And that's why the second point is forgo. That this strange woman, this immoral woman that's described in Proverbs 5, we're told to forgo her, to stay away from her. Proverbs 5, verses 7 and 8, it says, "Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth." And notice in verse 8 it says, "Remove thy way from her, and come not nigh to the door of her house." Later on in this book, and this woman's mentioned a few other times, and it's not clear exactly what she is, and maybe that's on purpose, because this woman could fit, a woman who a prostitute, that is mentioned in the book. This could be a prostitute. This woman could just be a sexually immoral woman who is interested in sleeping around. We're not told exactly who she is or what kind of woman she is. And it's probably because this is a proverbial woman that fits the mold of, get anyone who's going to lead your heart away from God if you get involved with her. And so again, we're told to forgo this woman. And not only does this apply to single men, but as we'll see later on in this context in chapter 5, this also applies to married men. And he talks about, finding satisfaction in the wife of your youth and being faithful to your wife. So this speaks to both single men and married men, that we ought to avoid entangling our lives with someone who does not have faith in God, who is doing things and tempting us to be immoral. So continuing with verses 9 and following, we're told to stay away from this woman. Verse 8, and remove thy way from her. Verse 9 says, lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, how I've hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and the assembly. So in verse 9, it speaks about giving your honor, giving your years to the cruel. And the idea is that the man's life is wasted, his years are wasted on this woman because it's a woman who does not care about him. And, again, I think it just makes sense that if you want your years to mean something, you should try to invest them in a partner who actually cares about you, who cares about God. Just to quickly review the things stated here, there are at least 5 reasons why sexual immorality or adultery is foolishness. He provides at least 5 reasons, and I think these are good, easy 5 points. Again, to teach our children as they mature and to remind ourselves of in our lives as married individuals and single individuals. 5 reasons why sexual immorality is foolishness. The first one, he says, for a young man, it will waste your youth. And we see that in verse 9. Instead of using your prime years to build a lasting relationship with a godly woman, they're squandered. And I've known of people who are in this predicament where they're getting into their 40s, 50s, maybe women care a little bit more about this because, I don't know the right way to say this, women can only have children up to a certain age, and so women who want to have children, I think, become more conscious of when they're getting older, and maybe they're not married yet and want to get married and have kids. So, instead of using your prime years to create a long-lasting relationship, those years are, wasted. They're squandered. Number 2, it will cost you money. We see that in verse 10. It will cost you money. Verse 10 says, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. So it's going to cost you money. Why invest your money and possessions in a person who is not going to be in a long-term relationship with you? A person who's not going to be your wife. And so instead of helping you build something together with a lifelong partner, those resources are going to go to someone else. And again, this I think applies to single men, but I think would also in today's culture apply even more to married men. Think about all the expenses in a divorce. If you have children, there's child support. Sometimes there's alimony. And typically when people get divorced, they move away. There's there's all kinds of money involved. I know there's more to life than money, but he does mention that specifically in verse 10. So maybe you've heard the phrase, it's cheaper to keep her, right? Hopefully your marriage should be more than that, but, that is a practical thing that's presented here. Immorality can cost you money. Number 3, it can cost your health. And we see that in verse 11. Verse 11. It says, thou mourn at the last. Notice it says, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. Now, what exactly does that mean? My answer is I don't know. It could be kind of the same idea presented in verse 9, where it talks about, your youthful years, your early years are kind of spent in vain. And so in that sense, your body, your vitality is consumed. One commentary I read suggests that verse 11 is referring to diseases which are contracted from sleeping around. That's certainly possibility and something that still even exists today. So, I mean, there's that real danger, and that still happens today.
Another thought here is that when we're in our younger years, we are energetic, we are creative, we're building and constructing, and those are wasted if it's on the wrong person. So we get to a point where, like the Ecclesiastes says, we no longer care for those things. The age has become, we have no goals, no desires for those things.
That's right. Number 4, sexual immorality and adultery can cause regret. And when you look at everything that's said in this context here, all the risks that are described, they're not worth it. Especially not worth the cost of your soul for someone who continues in unrepentant sin. It's not worth a brief fling or affair. It can cause regret. And then lastly, the 5th reason, it can jeopardize your standing with God and His people. In verse 14, Solomon mentions the congregation and the assembly. And I believe he's talking about, the God's people, that, if he gives into this temptation, it's going to cost him standing among God's people. And in this whole context, and we'll get there eventually, but in verse 21, it says, "The ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He pondereth all his goings." And this is said specifically in light of what a man does in his marriage and how he conducts himself in that area of life, that God knows everything. And so if someone is not being faithful, God knows the truth. And He holds people accountable for their actions. And so all the risks here outweigh the rewards. It can waste your youthful years, cost you money, cost your health. It can cause you regret. And ultimately, if someone is going to continue in an immoral way of life, it can cost them respect and standing among God's people and with God Himself. It's just not worth it. And so that's why, as we continue reading, Solomon speaks about fidelity and how that we should be true to our spouse. Are there any questions, comments before we move on to this third point? Yes, sir.
For verse 12, mine says, "How I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction." Just makes me think about how a lot of times our young folks have attitudes about getting correction, or don't want to do what they're told, or authority issues. It's really, that's part of teaching a child discipline, because you're trying to teach them a lifelong respect for authority, respect for government, respect for police, respect for God. By teaching a child, you're helping that child not have an attitude toward discipline. Parents should discipline their children.
Yeah, that's right. And the one thing I would add to that, I can say this because I've spoken to other preachers about it. It is somewhat nerve-wracking to talk about this subject because it's so personal. And I know regarding, like I said before, what Jesus teaches about marriage, a lot of people who don't do that today. And preachers today aren't saying that because it brings warmth to their heart. It's because they care about your soul. And it's sad when I've seen it happen. I know lots of people have seen it happen. They ruin their lives, ruin their marriage because they don't listen to what Jesus said. And that's the kind of regret that's being discussed. There's some very practical lessons here. Okay, so moving on, verses 15 and following. Again, just as a warning, if it's not clear already, there is some mature content, I guess you could say, presented. But I mean, we're all adults. Most of us are married, so we know all about these things. Again, some mature things said and very practical things said in verses 15 and following. So chapter 5, verses 15 and following says, drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be only thine, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and a pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquities shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of sins. He shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. So in verses 15 through 18, we find the euphemism of water. And here, drinking water represents intimacy. It's a euphemism, it's a metaphor. So in plain terms, again, this idea of drinking water out of your own cistern, out of your own well, in plain terms, the text is saying the husband is to find physical satisfaction with his wife and no other woman. Again, his own cistern, his own well, my understanding is in ancient times, most houses would have a local well or their own well or even their own personal cistern where they would collect rainwater for their water supply. So he's saying, stick to what is yours, your own woman, your own wife. I am reading from the King James, and here the King James is a little confusing. If you're using the King James like I am, you should notice what verse 16 says. It says, let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. And that might seem odd because he's saying, if you look at the other verse in the context, he's saying you should not do that. And I think most of us know this, but if you use the King James, the word let in the King James sometimes has the opposite meaning of how we use it today. So, if you say, let me go to the movies or something, you're saying, allow me to do that. But there are times in the King James where let means do not allow.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's how, in the King James it's a statement. In other translations, it's a question, rhetorical. Does anyone have verse 16 as a question?
Earl does.
Okay, can you read that?
It says, should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? Question mark.
There you go. So should your springs overflow in the streets and so on? And the answer to this question is no. You should not do that. And again, this is a euphemism for intimacy. The whole idea here is saying that you should, be faithful to your spouse and not be spreading your intimacy
We have
abroad.
a passage in Hebrews 13 that we often use part of it, I think, in the wrong context. And that is where it says that marriage is honorable among all, but the bed of the adulterers God will judge. And then it goes, the next verse says, be content with such things as you have. And we normally try to put that over in deeds, but I think it's dealing with our partners in marriage.
Yeah.
Not, being an adulterer. So contextually, that's the scene of that passage.
Yeah. And we see that same idea here, right?
Exactly.
So he does get into some poetic language, again, this whole idea of water being a euphemism. But again, verse 19, he gives some very straightforward language, doesn't he? Again, the idea is that a man should find not only satisfaction, he says, be ravished with your wife's love. I think some translations say be intoxicated with your wife's love. And so that's something you should try to keep going in a marriage and not lose that. Now, we'll come back to this issue again because this comes up again more than once in the book. One practical reason to avoid adultery, later on in the book it speaks about if you get caught and the husband of the woman you're with finds out, it talks about how he might just beat the living tar out of you. That's one reason to avoid this issue by itself. There's some very practical reasons, but there's spiritual reasons as well. And I know we're running short on time, but again, if in this whole context about fidelity to your wife, in verse 21, it says, the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his goings. I mean, what a powerful verse. Not only does God know what we do, but he thinks about what we do. He thinks about our choices. He thinks about our motivation. He ponders all our goings. And this is a verse that speaks about God's omniscience, or in plainer terms, that God is all-knowing, that he knows everything. And this is why he is the perfect judge. And if one spouse is not being true, if a husband's not being true to his wife, God knows that, and God ponders our goings. With the brief amount of time we have, I want you to consider what this book says about this strange woman. Again, there's a lot of, I think, practical, everyday application, but I think it goes beyond that. I think it gets into the spiritual. This woman, she's mentioned in chapter 2:16, it says she has flattering words. In chapter 7:21, it says she has fair speech. In what we've read today, in chapter 5, verse 3, it says her lips drop honey. Her mouth is smoother than oil. You know, there's a lot of attention brought to what she says. And I believe this woman is in a certain sense, she's sin personified. She is foolishness or folly personified. Just as earlier in the book we read about the wisdom of God personified as a woman. And so I think this woman presented in chapter 5 and other passages in this book represents the counterpart to wisdom. She's the opposite of wisdom and godliness. And even though she is alluring, her words are attractive. If you look at verse 3, those honey words soon turn bitter. If you look at the next verse, chapter 5, verse 4. Her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold of hell, or Sheol, as some translations say. And we'll stop there, but I think that's one of the problems with sin and why we have to be willing to think clearly about sinful activity. It often appears pleasant. It appears like something which is nice and good, but in the end, it brings us heartache, and it always is going to separate us from God if we do not repent of it. And I think that brings us kind of full circle to what we talked about before, that we should always remain humble, trusting in God and trusting in His Word.